Sarah Martinez stepped out of the military transport vehicle, her boots hitting the dusty ground of the NATO airbase in Eastern Europe. The cold morning air bit at her face as she looked around at the sprawling facility. Massive hangars stretched across the horizon, fighter jets lined up like sleeping metal birds. The sound of engines roared in the distance as pilots conducted their morning training exercises. She adjusted her equipment bag on her shoulder and walked toward the main building. At 28 years old, Sarah had worked her way up through the ranks of military communications technology. She held advanced degrees in electronic warfare and signal intelligence, but none of that seemed to matter to the people she was about to meet. The base commander, Colonel Harrison, had specifically requested her for this assignment. There had been unusual radio transmissions detected in the region, strange signals that didn't match any known military or civilian patterns. Sarah's job was to analyze these signals and determine if they posed a threat to NATO operations. As she entered the communications center, conversations stopped. Heads turned in her direction and she could feel the weight of dozens of stares. The room was filled with seasoned military personnel, most of them men who had been stationed at various bases around the world for decades. Well, what do we have here?" called out a voice from across the room. Staff Sergeant Miller, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, stood up from his workstation. "Looks like headquarters sent us a little girl to do a man's job." Laughter rippled through the room. Sarah kept her expression neutral, though she felt heat rising in her cheeks. She had faced this kind of treatment before, but it never got easier. "I heard they sent some hotshot analyst," said another voice. "Didn't know it would be someone who looks like she should be serving coffee instead of analyzing enemy communications." More laughter followed. Sarah walked steadily toward the workstation that had been assigned to her, ignoring the comments and whispers that followed her movement. She had learned long ago that responding to such remarks only made things worse. "Hey, sweetheart," Miller called out again. "You sure you know how to operate all this fancy equipment? These aren't toys from my electronics store." Sarah finally turned to face him. "Staff Sergeant Miller, I presume? I'm here on direct orders from NATO Command. I suggest we focus on the mission rather than my appearance." This brought another round of chuckles from the assembled personnel. Miller walked over to her workstation, his boots clicking on the concrete floor. "Listen, Princess," he said, lowering his voice but still speaking loud enough for others to hear. "This isn't some classroom exercise. Out here, when things go wrong, people die. We can't afford to have someone learning on the job." Sarah set down her equipment bag and began unpacking her specialized gear. "I understand the stakes, Sergeant. That's why I'm here." "The stakes?" Miller laughed. "You think you understand the stakes? Lady, I've been in communications for 15 years. I've served in 3 combat zones. I've seen what happens when intel goes wrong." Other personnel had gathered around now, watching the exchange with obvious amusement. Sarah could hear whispered comments about her age, her gender, her civilian appearance. Some wondered aloud why NATO Command would send someone so inexperienced to handle such an important assignment. "Maybe she's someone's daughter," suggested one of the technicians. "You know how these political appointments work." "Or maybe she slept her way into the position," added another voice, which brought knowing looks and more laughter. Sarah's hands remained steady as she connected her equipment to the base's communication systems. She had faced worse than this during her training and early career. What bothered her most wasn't the personal attacks, but the assumption that she couldn't do her job effectively. "Tell you what," Miller said, leaning against her workstation. "Why don't you show us what you can do? These mysterious signals everyone's so worried about. They're probably just atmospheric interference or some farmer's radio equipment malfunctioning." He gestured toward the main monitoring station. "We've been tracking these signals for 2 weeks. Every analyst who's looked at them says they're nothing to worry about. So what makes you think you can find something we missed?" Sarah looked up from her equipment setup. "I don't think anything, Sergeant. I'm here to analyze the data and provide an assessment. Nothing more, nothing less. Data," Miller repeated, shaking his head. "That's the problem with you academic types. You think everything can be solved with data and theories. Out here in the real world, you need experience. You need instincts." The room had grown quieter now, with more personnel stopping their work to watch the confrontation. Sarah could feel the tension building, but she continued with her setup procedure. "I've reviewed the preliminary reports," she said calmly. "The signal patterns are indeed unusual. They don't match standard communication protocols or known interference sources. See? Miller announced to the room. She's already trying to make something out of nothing. Probably wants to justify her fancy education and her big government salary. Sarah finished connecting her final piece of equipment and turned on her monitoring systems. Banks of screens flickered to life, displaying wave patterns, frequency analyses, and signal strength measurements. The signals appear to follow a specific timing pattern, she observed, studying the displays. They occur at regular intervals, always lasting exactly 47 seconds, always on the same frequency range. Coincidence, Miller said dismissively. Equipment malfunctions can be regular too. But Sarah was already deep in her analysis, her fingers flying across multiple keyboards as she cross-referenced the signals with various databases. The patterns she was seeing troubled her, though she kept her concerns to herself for now. The mockery continued throughout the morning. Every time Sarah asked a question or requested access to additional data, someone made a comment about her inexperience or suggested that she was wasting everyone's time. When she asked to review the base's defensive protocols, Miller laughed openly. Defensive protocols? What, you think these radio signals are going to attack us? Maybe we should alert the media that the enemy is using sound waves as weapons. Even some of the officers joined in the ridicule. Captain Rodriguez, the communications officer, made jokes about how NATO was obviously lowering its standards if they were sending people like Sarah to handle critical intelligence work. But as the day wore on, Sarah's analysis began to reveal disturbing patterns. The signals weren't random at all. They contained embedded data streams, coded information that was being transmitted in short bursts designed to avoid detection by standard monitoring equipment. She worked quietly, documenting her findings and building a comprehensive picture of what she was discovering. The more she analyzed the signals, the more convinced she became that they represented a serious threat to the base and its operations. By evening, as the day shift prepared to hand over duties to the night crew, Sarah had compiled enough evidence to request a meeting with Colonel Harrison, but she knew that convincing anyone to take her seriously would be an uphill battle, given the day's reception. The next morning brought no relief from the ridicule. Sarah arrived at the communications center early, hoping to continue her analysis without interruption, but as soon as the day shift arrived, the comments resumed. "Look who's back," announced Sergeant Peterson, a wiry man with sharp eyes. "Our little signal detective. Find any enemy spies hiding in the radio waves yet?" Sarah ignored him and focused on her screens. Overnight, her automated monitoring systems had captured 17 more signal bursts. Each one followed the same pattern she had identified the day before, but now she was beginning to decode the embedded information. "I need to speak with Colonel Harrison," she announced to the room. Miller looked up from his coffee cup and laughed. "Already giving up? That was quick even for a rookie. I'm not giving up. I've found something important in the signal analysis." "Important?" Captain Rodriguez entered the conversation. "Let me guess. You've discovered that Farmer Johnson's tractor radio is interfering with our communications." The room erupted in laughter again. Sarah felt her patience wearing thin, but she maintained her professional composure. "The signals contain coded military intelligence," she said firmly. "Someone is conducting surveillance on this base." The laughter stopped abruptly. Miller set down his coffee cup and walked over to her workstation. "That's a pretty serious accusation, Princess. You better have some solid evidence to back up a claim like that." Sarah pulled up her analysis on the main display screen. Each signal burst contains compressed data packets. When decoded, they include information about our flight schedules, personnel movements, and equipment deployments. Peterson joined Miller in examining the display. "This just looks like random noise to me." "How do you know it's not equipment interference?" "Because the data correlates with our operational schedule," Sarah explained. "Every time we launch aircraft for training exercises, these signals increase in frequency and contain specific information about takeoff times, flight paths, and aircraft types." Captain Rodriguez studied the displays with growing interest. "Show me the correlation data." Sarah brought up a side-by-side comparison of the base's flight logs and the signal intercepts. The patterns were undeniable. Every major operational activity was followed within hours by corresponding signals that contained detailed information about those activities. "This could still be coincidence," Miller insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Not with this level of detail," Sarah replied. She highlighted specific sections of the decoded signals. Look at this transmission from yesterday. It includes the tail numbers of our F-16 aircraft, their fuel loads, and their intended training areas. This information isn't available through casual observation. The room had grown quiet now. Other personnel had gathered around to examine Sarah's findings. The mockery had been replaced by serious attention to the data she was presenting. "Where are these signals originating?" asked Rodriguez. Sarah manipulated the display to show triangulation data. "Based on signal strength and timing analysis, I've narrowed the source to a radius of approximately 15 kilometers northeast of the base. That's mostly farmland," Peterson observed. "Nothing but crops and a few small villages." "Perfect cover for a surveillance operation," Sarah replied. "Remote location, minimal traffic, easy to blend in with normal agricultural activity." Miller was studying the decoded intelligence with obvious concern. "If this is real, how long have they been watching us?" Sarah pulled up historical data from the base's communication logs. "I've found similar signal patterns going back at least 6 months. They've been conducting systematic surveillance of our operations for an extended period." The implications were staggering. If enemy agents had been monitoring the base for months, they would have detailed information about NATO defensive capabilities, operational procedures, and personnel assignments. "We need to inform Colonel Harrison immediately," Rodriguez decided. "This level of surveillance represents a significant security breach." But Miller wasn't ready to accept Sarah's analysis. "Hold on a minute. This is all theoretical. We're talking about potentially starting an international incident based on the guesswork of someone who's been here for exactly 2 days." "It's not guesswork," Sarah replied firmly. "The data is clear. Someone is conducting professional-level surveillance of this facility." "Professional level?" Miller challenged. "How do you know it's professional? Maybe it's just some local ham radio operator who happens to live near the base." Sarah brought up additional analysis screens. "The encoding methods are sophisticated. This isn't amateur radio equipment. The signals use military-grade encryption and compression techniques." She highlighted specific technical details of the transmissions. "The timing protocols match those used by Eastern European intelligence services. The frequency hopping patterns are consistent with professional surveillance equipment." Peterson examined the technical specifications with growing alarm. "If she's right about the encryption methods, this is definitely not civilian equipment." "There's more," Sarah continued. She displayed another set of data. "The surveillance isn't random. It's focused specifically on our most sensitive operations. Combat aircraft movements, weapons deliveries, personnel transfers. Someone is building a comprehensive intelligence picture of our capabilities." Rodriguez was now fully convinced of the threat. "We can't afford to ignore this. Even if there's a chance she's wrong, the potential consequences are too serious." But the ridicule hadn't completely stopped. Several personnel still viewed Sarah's conclusions with skepticism. "Look, I'm sure the little lady means well," said Technical Sergeant Brooks, an older man with weathered hands. "But jumping to conclusions about enemy surveillance based on some radio static seems like a stretch." "Radio static?" Sarah turned to face him. "I've shown you decoded intelligence data. This isn't static, it's organized information theft." "Organized by who?" Brooks challenged. "You're asking us to believe that enemy agents have been sitting in some farmhouse for months, watching our every move, and nobody noticed until you showed up?" Sarah felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed because of her appearance and relative youth. "I'm asking you to look at the evidence objectively." "Evidence," Miller repeated. "What evidence?" "Some computer analysis that could be completely wrong. For all we know, your fancy equipment is creating patterns that don't actually exist." The doubt in the room was palpable. Despite the compelling nature of her findings, many personnel still seemed reluctant to accept that the young woman they had been mocking could have uncovered such a significant security threat. "There's one way to verify my analysis," Sarah announced. "We can conduct a field investigation of the signal source area." Rodriguez nodded. "That makes sense. If there really is surveillance equipment in that area, we should be able to locate it. And if we don't find anything," Miller added, "then we know this whole theory is just academic speculation." Sarah accepted the challenge. "Fine. But if I'm right about the surveillance, this base is in immediate danger. Every day we delay gives the enemy more intelligence about our operations." As the debate continued, none of them realized that their conversation was being monitored. Hidden equipment in the nearby hills was recording their voices. transmitting their words to handlers who were very interested in Sarah's discoveries. The surveillance operation she had uncovered was more extensive and dangerous than anyone imagined. And by identifying the threat, Sarah had unknowingly made herself and everyone on the base a target. Colonel Harrison studied Sarah's findings with the serious attention they deserved. Unlike the communications personnel, he had decades of experience in military intelligence and recognized the significance of what she had uncovered. "This is extremely troubling," he said, reviewing the decoded signals. "If your analysis is correct, we're facing a comprehensive intelligence breach." Sarah sat across from him in his office, feeling relieved that someone was finally taking her discoveries seriously. "The sophistication of the surveillance suggests state-level involvement, sir. This isn't the work of random criminals or amateur spies." Harrison nodded grimly. "I'm authorizing an immediate field investigation. We need to locate the source of these transmissions and determine the extent of the surveillance operation." "Sir, I recommend extreme caution," Sarah warned. "If the enemy realizes we've discovered their operation, they might accelerate whatever plans they're making." "Agreed. We'll conduct the investigation quietly, using a small team of specialists." Meanwhile, back in the communications center, the skepticism continued. Despite Sarah's presentation to the colonel, many personnel remained unconvinced of the threat. "I still think she's making a mountain out of a molehill," Miller told his colleagues during lunch. "These academic types always want to find conspiracy theories in everything." "Maybe," Peterson replied, "but what if she's right? What if someone really has been watching us for months?" "Then where are they?" Brooks interjected. "If enemy spies have been operating near the base for months, why haven't our security patrols spotted them?" It was a valid question. The base maintained regular security sweeps of the surrounding area, and nothing suspicious had been reported by the patrol teams. Professional surveillance operations are designed to avoid detection, Peterson pointed out. "If they're using remote equipment and staying well hidden, our patrols might not find them. Or," Miller suggested, "there's nothing to find because the whole thing is just computer analysis gone wrong." The debate continued throughout the day, dividing the base personnel into those who believed Sarah's findings and those who remained skeptical. But the division didn't matter to the people conducting the surveillance. In a concealed observation post 15 kilometers from the base, 3 intelligence operatives monitored the NATO facility through sophisticated equipment. They had indeed been watching for months, building detailed profiles of the base's operations and personnel. "The analyst has discovered our signals," reported Victor, the team leader. "She's decoded our transmissions and identified our location area." His partner, Elena, looked up from her monitoring equipment. "How much does she know?" "Enough to compromise the operation. She's provided accurate analysis of our methods and identified the intelligence content of our transmissions." The third operative, Dmitri, was already packing sensitive equipment. "We should evacuate immediately. If they conduct a field search, they'll find our position." But Victor shook his head. "Our orders are clear. The operation must continue until the target window opens. We can't abandon 6 months of preparation because of one analyst." "Then we need to discredit her findings," Elena suggested. "Make it look like her analysis was wrong." Victor considered this option. They had the capability to transmit false signals that would confuse Sarah's equipment and make her conclusions appear inaccurate. But such deception carried its own risks. "The priority is protecting the main operation," he decided. "We'll continue monitoring and adjust our methods to avoid detection." Back at the base, Sarah was preparing for the field investigation. Colonel Harrison had assembled a small team of security specialists and electronic warfare experts to search for the surveillance equipment. "We'll conduct the search in civilian clothes," Harrison explained to the team. "We don't want to alert anyone who might be watching that we're conducting a military operation." Sarah would accompany the team to provide technical expertise in identifying surveillance equipment. Despite her success in convincing the colonel, she still faced skepticism from some team members. "Are we really sure about this?" asked Lieutenant Thompson, one of the security specialists. "Spending resources on a wild goose chase because some analyst thinks she found enemy spies?" "The colonel believes the threat is credible," replied Sergeant Williams, the team leader. "That's good enough for me." But Thompson's doubts reflected a broader uncertainty about Sarah's findings. Many personnel still couldn't believe that someone so young and inexperienced could have discovered something that the base's seasoned intelligence officers had missed. As the team prepared to depart, Sarah reviewed her analysis one final time. The signal patterns were clear and consistent. The decoded intelligence was accurate, and the technical sophistication was undeniable. She was confident in her conclusions, but she also knew that her reputation depended on the team finding actual evidence of surveillance. "What exactly are we looking for?" asked Thompson. Sarah showed him photographs of typical surveillance equipment. Hidden antennas, camouflaged observation posts, buried cables, anything that could transmit the signals we've been intercepting. "And if we don't find anything?" Sarah met his skeptical gaze directly. "Then I'll accept that my analysis was wrong. But the data suggests we will find something." The team departed the base in unmarked vehicles, following routes that would take them through the farmland northeast of the facility. Sarah monitored her equipment continuously, tracking the signal strength to guide them toward the source. "Signal is getting stronger," she reported as they approached a cluster of farm buildings. "The source should be within a few hundred meters of this location." The team dismounted and began a careful search of the area. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Crops growing in neat rows. Farm equipment parked in appropriate locations. No signs of unusual activity, but Sarah's equipment continued to detect strong signals from somewhere nearby. "The transmission source is close," she insisted. "Within 50 meters of our current position." Thompson looked around at the peaceful farmland. "I don't see anything that looks like spy equipment." "Professional surveillance gear is designed to be invisible," Sarah reminded him. "It could be buried underground, hidden in farm equipment, or camouflaged to look like natural features." Sergeant Williams began a systematic search pattern, checking for any anomalies in the landscape. After 30 minutes of careful examination, he made a discovery that changed everything. "Martinez, come look at this," he called out. Sarah hurried to his position, where he was examining what appeared to be a normal fence post. But closer inspection revealed subtle modifications, hidden cables, a small antenna disguised as part of the post structure, and electronic components concealed within the wooden frame. "This is it," Sarah confirmed, her equipment registering strong signal activity from the modified fence post. "This is one of their transmission points." Thompson's skepticism evaporated as he examined the sophisticated surveillance equipment. "How long has this been here?" "Based on the weathering and installation methods, at least several months," Williams assessed. "This is professional-grade intelligence equipment." Sarah was already scanning the area for additional surveillance points. "If they have one transmission post, they probably have others. We need to map the entire surveillance network." As the team spread out to search for additional equipment, none of them noticed the small camera hidden in a nearby tree, transmitting their activities to the concealed observation post. The surveillance team they were hunting was watching every move they made. Victor observed the NATO search team through his monitoring equipment with growing concern. "They found transmission post 3. They're conducting a systematic search for our other installations." "How much of our network can they discover?" Elena asked. "If they're thorough, they could find all of our fixed installations. But they won't find us. This position is too well concealed." Dmitri was monitoring communications from the NATO base. "They're reporting their discoveries back to base command. This will confirm the analyst's findings and validate her threat assessment." Victor made a crucial decision. "Signal Moscow. Tell them the surveillance operation has been compromised. Request immediate authorization for contingency protocols." The discovery of the surveillance equipment had proven Sarah's analysis correct, but it had also escalated the situation far beyond anyone's expectations. What had started as an intelligence-gathering operation was about to become something much more dangerous. The discovery of the surveillance equipment sent shockwaves through the NATO base. Within hours of the field team's return, Colonel Harrison had called an emergency briefing for all senior personnel. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison announced to the assembled officers, "we are facing a confirmed intelligence breach. Analyst Martinez's findings have been validated by physical evidence." The briefing room was packed with personnel who had spent days mocking Sarah's conclusions. Now they sat in stunned silence as Harrison presented photographs of the sophisticated surveillance equipment discovered in the farmland. "The equipment we found represents months of professional intelligence gathering," Harrison continued. "Enemy operatives have been systematically monitoring our operations, collecting detailed information about our capabilities, schedules, and procedures." Sarah sat in the front row, feeling a mixture of vindication and apprehension. Being right about the surveillance threat brought no satisfaction, when the implications were so serious. Staff Sergeant Miller, who had been among her harshest critics, raised his hand. "Sir, what does this mean for base security? If they've been watching us for months, what do they plan to do with the intelligence?" "That's what we need to determine," Harrison replied. "Analyst Martinez will brief us on her assessment of the threat level and potential enemy objectives." Sarah stood and walked to the front of the room, facing the same personnel who had dismissed her just days earlier. The mockery had been replaced by serious attention, but she could still feel the weight of their skepticism. "Based on the intelligence patterns we've detected," she began, "the surveillance operation appears focused on our air operations. The enemy has been systematically collecting information about flight schedules, aircraft capabilities, and pilot assignments." She displayed her analysis on the main screen. "The timing and focus of the surveillance suggests preparation for a specific operation targeting our air assets." "What kind of operation?" asked Captain Rodriguez. "Most likely an attack designed to neutralize our air capabilities," Sarah replied. "They've gathered enough intelligence to plan precision strikes against our most valuable aircraft and facilities." The room erupted in concerned murmurs. An attack on the base would represent a major escalation in regional tensions, potentially triggering broader conflict. "Do we know who's conducting the surveillance?" asked Major Stevens, the base intelligence officer. Sarah presented her technical analysis of the equipment and methods. The sophistication and techniques match those used by Eastern European intelligence services. "This is a state-sponsored operation, not the work of terrorist groups or criminals." Colonel Harrison nodded grimly. "NATO command has been briefed on our findings. Additional security measures are being implemented immediately, but even as they discussed defensive preparations, the enemy surveillance team was adapting to the new situation. Victor and his operatives had received new orders from Moscow. Orders that would transform their intelligence mission into something far more dangerous. "Contingency Protocol 7 has been authorized," Victor announced to his team. "We are no longer just gathering intelligence. We have been ordered to neutralize the threat posed by the analyst's discoveries." Elena looked up from her equipment. "Neutralize how?" "The analyst has demonstrated the ability to detect and decode our operations. Her continued presence threatens not just this mission, but future operations throughout the region." Dmitri understood the implications immediately. "You're talking about assassination." "I'm talking about protecting vital state interests," Victor corrected. "The analyst's skills make her a strategic threat. Moscow has classified her as a high-value target." The mission parameters had changed dramatically. What began as passive surveillance was becoming an active operation targeting Sarah personally. Her success in uncovering the spy network had made her a marked woman. Back at the base, Sarah was working frantically to analyze the captured surveillance equipment. The devices contained data storage systems that might reveal the full extent of the intelligence breach. "I'm finding months of stored data," she reported to Colonel Harrison. "Flight schedules, personnel records, equipment specifications. They've been building a comprehensive intelligence database." Harrison studied the recovered information with growing alarm. This level of detail would allow them to plan devastating attacks against our operations. "There's something else," Sarah added. "The surveillance equipment was designed for remote activation. They could have triggered additional recording modes or transmitted emergency signals if they felt threatened." "You think they know we found their equipment?" "I'm certain they know. Professional surveillance operations always include counter-surveillance measures. They've been watching us search for them." This realization added another layer of urgency to their situation. If the enemy knew their surveillance had been compromised, they might accelerate whatever plans they had been developing. Throughout the day, Sarah continued analyzing the captured data, while security teams searched for additional surveillance points. They found 2 more concealed transmission posts and evidence of temporary observation positions that had been recently abandoned. "They're pulling back," reported Sergeant Williams after the extended search. "Some of the equipment shows signs of hasty removal." Sarah reviewed the pattern of equipment discoveries and removals. "They're consolidating their operation, probably moving to a more secure location while maintaining essential surveillance capabilities." "Can you track where they've gone?" "Not directly, but I can monitor for continued signal activity. If they're still watching us, I should be able to detect their transmissions." As evening approached, Sarah set up extended monitoring protocols to watch for any ongoing surveillance signals. Her equipment operated continuously, scanning all frequencies for the characteristic patterns she had learned to identify. But the enemy team had made significant changes to their methods. Using different equipment and modified transmission protocols, they resumed their surveillance from a new location, carefully avoiding the detection patterns Sarah had used to find them previously. "She's looking for us," Elena observed, monitoring Sarah's scanning activities. "Her equipment is searching all the frequencies we used before." "Then we use different frequencies," Victor replied. "We adapt faster than she can analyze." "What about the assassination order?" Victor checked his secure communication device. "Moscow wants the target eliminated within 48 hours. They consider her an immediate threat to national security interests." The surveillance team began planning a completely different type of operation. Instead of hiding in the countryside gathering intelligence, they would infiltrate the base area and target Sarah directly. As Sarah worked late into the night, she remained unaware that she had become the primary target of the very operation she had uncovered. Her success in detecting the surveillance network had saved the base from one threat, but it had created an even more dangerous situation. The equipment she monitored showed decreasing signal activity, which she interpreted as evidence that the surveillance operation was winding down. In reality, the enemy team was simply changing tactics, preparing for a direct assault rather than continued observation. "I think we've disrupted their operation," she reported to Colonel Harrison during a late-night briefing. "Signal activity has dropped significantly. They may be withdrawing from the area." Harrison was less optimistic, or they're preparing for something more aggressive. "We need to maintain maximum security until we're certain the threat has passed." His caution would prove prescient. The enemy team was indeed preparing something more aggressive, and Sarah herself was at the center of their new mission objectives. Within hours, the NATO base would face a direct attack designed not just to gather intelligence, but to eliminate the analyst who had threatened to expose an entire network of surveillance operations across Europe. The attack came at 0347 hours, during the quiet period when most base personnel were asleep and security was at its minimum staffing level. Sarah was still in the communications center, working through the night to analyze the captured surveillance data. The first indication of trouble came from her monitoring equipment. Unusual electromagnetic signatures appeared on her displays, different from the surveillance signals she had been tracking, but clearly artificial and purposeful. "That's strange," she murmured, adjusting her scanning parameters to get a clearer reading on the new signals. The signatures were moving, approaching the base perimeter from multiple directions. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what she was seeing: the electronic signatures of infiltration equipment. She immediately reached for the security alert phone. "This is Martinez in communications. I'm detecting multiple electronic signatures approaching the base perimeter. Possible hostile infiltration in progress." The security duty officer, Sergeant Davis, was initially skeptical. "Are you sure? Our perimeter sensors aren't showing anything unusual." "Your sensors are being jammed," Sarah replied urgently. "I'm reading sophisticated electronic warfare equipment. This is a coordinated attack." Even as she spoke, she could see the jamming signals intensifying, designed to blind the base's standard security systems. But her specialized equipment operated on different frequencies and used different detection methods. "I'm alerting Colonel Harrison," Davis decided. "Maintain your monitoring and report any changes." Sarah continued tracking the approaching signatures, her heart racing as she realized the scale of the operation. At least 6 distinct electronic sources were converging on the base from different directions, suggesting a well-coordinated assault team. Colonel Harrison arrived in the communications center within minutes, having been awakened by Davis's urgent call. "What's the situation, Martinez?" Sarah showed him the real-time display of approaching electronic signatures. "Hostile forces are infiltrating the base perimeter. They're using advanced jamming equipment to avoid detection by our standard security systems." Harrison immediately activated the base's emergency protocols. Alarms began sounding throughout the facility as security teams rushed to defensive positions. "Can you track their exact positions?" Harrison asked. "Yes, sir. My equipment can see through their jamming." Sarah manipulated her displays to show precise locations of the infiltrating forces. "They're moving in coordinated groups, suggesting professional military training." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The same specialized skills that had allowed Sarah to detect the surveillance operation were now the base's primary defense against the resulting attack. As security teams deployed to intercept the infiltrators, Sarah continued providing real-time intelligence about enemy movements. Her monitoring equipment could track the attackers' electronic signatures, even when they were invisible to standard sensors. "Contact with infiltrators at Checkpoint 7, reported Sergeant Williams over the radio. "They're using night vision and suppressed weapons. Definitely professional operators." Sarah watched the electronic battlefield unfold on her displays. The attackers were moving with precision and coordination, but her ability to track their equipment gave the defenders a crucial advantage. "Two teams approaching the main hangar," she reported. "They're trying to circle around behind our defensive positions." Harrison coordinated the base defense using Sarah's intelligence, directing security teams to intercept the infiltrators before they could reach their targets. But the enemy team had one specific objective that wasn't immediately apparent to the defenders. While most of the assault team created diversions by attacking multiple targets, Victor and Elena were moving directly toward the communications center. "Target is still in the communications facility," Victor reported to his team through encrypted radio. "We need to reach her before base security locks down the building." Sarah's specialized equipment had made her invaluable to the base defense, but it also made her location obvious to the attackers. They could track her electronic emissions just as she could track theirs. "Colonel," Sarah said suddenly, realizing the pattern of enemy movements, "I think they're targeting the communications center specifically." Harrison looked at her displays with growing alarm. "You think they're after you personally?" "It's the only explanation that fits their movement pattern. They're using the other attacks as diversions while two operatives approach this building." Harrison immediately called for additional security to protect the communications center, but the base's defensive resources were already stretched thin, responding to multiple infiltration points. "We need to evacuate you to a secure location," Harrison decided, but Sarah shook her head. "If I leave, you lose your ability to track the attackers. My equipment is the only thing that can see through their jamming." It was a terrible choice. Protect Sarah by moving her to safety, or keep her in position to provide crucial intelligence for the base defense. "Two hostiles approaching the east entrance of this building," Sarah reported, watching their electronic signatures close in on the communications center. Sergeant Davis and two security guards took positions to defend the communications center. Sarah continued monitoring the attackers' approach, providing precise updates on their location and movements. "They're at the building perimeter now," she reported, moving along the east wall toward the main entrance. The lights in the communications center suddenly went out as the infiltrators cut power to the building. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting eerie red shadows across the equipment. "They're trying to disable our systems," Harrison observed, but Sarah's equipment operated on independent power supplies designed for exactly this type of situation. Her displays remained active, continuing to track the electronic signatures of the approaching hostiles. "I can still see them," she announced. "They're splitting up, one moving to the main entrance, the other heading for the emergency exit." Davis positioned his guards to cover both entrances while Harrison tried to coordinate with other security teams across the base. But radio communications were being jammed, making coordination difficult. Sarah realized that her monitoring equipment could do more than just track the attackers. "I can use my jamming capabilities against them," she told Harrison. "If I can disrupt their communications, they won't be able to coordinate their assault." "Do it," Harrison ordered. Sarah began transmitting targeted interference signals designed to disrupt the attackers' communication frequencies. Within moments, she could see the effect on her displays as the hostile forces lost coordination. "Their movement patterns are becoming erratic," she reported. "They're losing communication with each other." Victor, approaching the main entrance, suddenly found his radio filled with static. The carefully planned assault was falling apart as his team lost the ability to coordinate their actions. "Elena, respond," he spoke into his radio, but received only electronic noise in return. At the same time, Sarah's jamming was affecting more than just communications. The sophisticated electronic equipment the infiltrators relied on for navigation and target acquisition was being disrupted by her countermeasures. "I'm degrading their night vision and targeting systems," Sarah reported. "They're operating partially blind now." The defenders pressed their advantage. Security teams, guided by Sarah's real-time intelligence and protected by her electronic countermeasures, began systematically hunting down the infiltrators. "Contact with hostile forces at Hangar 3, reported one security team. "Target neutralized." "Second infiltrator team contained at the fuel depot," announced another unit. But Victor and Elena were still closing in on the communications center, determined to complete their primary mission despite the deteriorating tactical situation. "Hostile at the main entrance," Davis whispered into his radio. "Moving to engage." Sarah watched the electronic signature pause at the entrance, then begin moving again with sudden urgency. "He's breaching the door," she warned. The sound of gunfire erupted from the main entrance as Davis and his guards engaged the infiltrator. Sarah could track the battle through the electronic signatures of weapons and equipment, but the outcome remained uncertain. "Davis is down," reported one of the guards. "Hostile is in the building." Sarah's display showed the infiltrator's electronic signature moving through the corridors of the communications center, heading directly toward her location. At the same time, the second attacker was breaching the emergency exit. "We're about to be surrounded," Harrison observed grimly. But Sarah had one more defensive capability. Her specialized equipment included non-lethal defensive systems designed to protect sensitive electronic installations. "I can activate the building's electromagnetic pulse system," she told Harrison. "It will disable all electronic equipment in the immediate area, including the attacker's gear." "That will disable your equipment too," Harrison pointed out. "Yes, but it will also blind the infiltrators completely. In the dark, without their electronic equipment, our security teams will have the advantage." It was a desperate gamble, but with hostile forces closing in from both directions, they had few options remaining. "Do it," Harrison ordered. Sarah initiated the electromagnetic pulse sequence. Her displays flickered and went dark as the powerful electronic burst disabled every piece of equipment in the building. The effect on the infiltrators was immediate and devastating. Victor, advancing through the darkened corridors with night vision equipment, suddenly found himself completely blind as his electronics failed. Elena, entering through the emergency exit, lost all navigation and communication capabilities as the electromagnetic pulse fried her equipment. In the sudden darkness and electronic silence, the advantage shifted dramatically to the defenders who knew the building layout and didn't rely on sophisticated equipment. Security reinforcements, arriving just as the electromagnetic pulse activated, moved through the building using traditional flashlights and basic radio communications that operated on frequencies unaffected by Sarah's countermeasures. "Building is secure," announced Sergeant Williams as his team systematically cleared each room. 2 hostiles neutralized, but the victory came at a significant cost. The electromagnetic pulse had disabled not just the attacker's equipment, but also much of the base's communication and monitoring systems. "How long before we can restore our defensive capabilities?" Harrison asked. Sarah, working by flashlight to assess the damage to her equipment, shook her head. "Several hours at minimum, maybe longer if the pulse damaged critical components." As dawn broke over the NATO base, the immediate threat had been neutralized, but the implications of the attack were staggering. Enemy forces had successfully infiltrated a secure military facility, and only Sarah's specialized skills had prevented a catastrophic security breach. The mockery she had endured just days earlier seemed like ancient history now. Her analysis had uncovered a surveillance network. Her intelligence had guided the base defense, and her countermeasures had defeated a professional assault team. But the attack also revealed that the surveillance operation was part of something much larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The morning after the attack brought a flood of high-ranking officials to the NATO base. Military intelligence officers, government representatives, and senior NATO commanders arrived to investigate the unprecedented security breach. Sarah found herself at the center of intense scrutiny, but this time the attention was entirely different from the mockery she had endured just days earlier. Now she was being treated as a hero who had single-handedly prevented a catastrophic intelligence disaster. "Your analysis and defensive actions saved this base," General Morrison, the NATO regional commander, told her during a private briefing. "Without your detection of the surveillance network and your countermeasures during the attack, we would have suffered severe casualties and compromised operations." The transformation in how base personnel treated Sarah was remarkable. Staff Sergeant Miller, who had been among her harshest critics, approached her during the morning briefing with obvious embarrassment. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. A big one. I was wrong about everything, and my attitude could have cost lives." Sarah accepted his apology graciously, though the memory of the ridicule still stung. "We all make mistakes, Sergeant. What matters is that we learned from this experience." But the investigation was revealing disturbing information about the scope of the enemy operation. The captured infiltrators, identified as highly trained intelligence operatives, had been part of a much larger network targeting NATO facilities across Eastern Europe. "This wasn't just about our base," Colonel Harrison explained to his staff. "Intelligence suggests similar surveillance. Operations have been conducted at multiple NATO installations throughout the region." Sarah's discovery had exposed what appeared to be a systematic effort to compromise NATO's defensive capabilities across an entire theater of operations. The implications were staggering. Enemy intelligence services had been conducting coordinated surveillance of critical military facilities for months or possibly years. "How many other bases might be compromised?" asked Captain Rodriguez. "That's what we need to determine," Harrison replied. "Martinez's detection methods are being implemented at other facilities to check for similar surveillance operations." Sarah was asked to brief intelligence officers from multiple NATO commands on her analysis, techniques, and detection methods. Her specialized knowledge, which had been dismissed as academic theory just days earlier, was now considered crucial for regional security. "The signal patterns you identified," said Major Collins from NATO intelligence, "they match suspicious transmissions we've detected at 3 other bases in the past month." Sarah reviewed the data from the other installations with growing concern. "The patterns are consistent. Someone has been conducting systematic surveillance across multiple facilities. Can you develop protocols to detect these operations at other bases?" "Yes, but we need to assume that the enemy will adapt their methods. They know we can detect their previous techniques, so they'll develop new approaches." This was the challenge facing NATO forces, staying ahead of an adversary that was constantly evolving its intelligence-gathering methods. Sarah's success had been a victory, but it was also just the beginning of a much larger counterintelligence effort. Throughout the day, Sarah worked with intelligence specialists to develop new detection protocols and defensive measures. Her equipment was being reverse-engineered to create similar capabilities for other installations, and her analysis methods were being documented for widespread distribution. "You've essentially created a new field of electronic counterintelligence," observed Dr. Reynolds, a civilian analyst working with NATO intelligence. "Your techniques could revolutionize how we detect and counter surveillance operations." But Sarah remained focused on immediate threats rather than long-term implications. "We need to find the rest of their network. The operatives who attacked us were part of a larger organization that's still active. The investigation of the captured surveillance equipment was revealing additional intelligence about enemy capabilities and objectives. Hidden data storage systems contained months of intelligence gathering from multiple sources, suggesting a coordinated effort involving dozens of operatives across several countries. They weren't just watching our operations, Sarah reported after analyzing the captured data. They were building targeting packages for potential attacks against multiple NATO facilities. This discovery elevated the threat assessment significantly. Instead of passive surveillance, the enemy had been actively preparing for coordinated attacks across the region. "We need to warn all NATO installations immediately," General Morrison decided. If they were planning attacks against multiple targets, other bases could be facing imminent threats. Sarah's role expanded beyond analysis to active counterintelligence operations. Her ability to detect and counter sophisticated surveillance made her invaluable for protecting other NATO facilities from similar threats. "I'm assigning you to a joint task force," Morrison told her. "Your mission will be to help other installations detect and neutralize surveillance operations before they can develop into attack threats." The transformation was complete. In less than a week, Sarah had gone from being mocked as an inexperienced analyst to being recognized as a crucial asset for regional security. Her specialized knowledge had not only saved her own base, but had also exposed a network of threats affecting NATO operations across Eastern Europe. But the enemy network was not finished. The failure of the attack on Sarah's base had alerted them that their methods were compromised, but it had also revealed the extent of NATO's new counterintelligence capabilities. In hidden locations across the region, other surveillance teams were receiving new orders. Their mission parameters were being updated to account for Sarah's detection methods, and new operational protocols were being implemented to avoid the techniques she had used to expose their activities. The analyst has become a priority target, reported the regional intelligence coordinator to his superiors in Moscow. Her methods threaten our entire surveillance network across the theater. Then we adapt, came the reply. Develop new techniques that can't be detected by her equipment, and find a way to neutralize her capabilities permanently. The battle between Sarah's detection methods and enemy surveillance techniques was escalating into a high-stakes game of technological cat and mouse. Each side would need to constantly evolve their capabilities to stay ahead of their opponents. As Sarah prepared to depart for her new assignment with the Joint Task Force, she realized that her discovery of the surveillance network had launched her into the center of a regional intelligence war. The mockery and ridicule she had endured seemed trivial compared to the challenges that lay ahead. "Ready for your new assignment?" Colonel Harrison asked as she packed her specialized equipment. "As ready as anyone can be for something like this," Sarah replied. "I just hope we can stay ahead of their adaptations." Harrison smiled grimly. "If anyone can do it, it's you. You've already proven that conventional wisdom doesn't always apply to unconventional threats." Sarah's departure from the base was marked by respect and gratitude from personnel who had initially dismissed her capabilities, but she knew that her real test was yet to come. The enemy network was still active, still dangerous, and now fully aware that NATO had developed new capabilities to counter their operations. The next phase of the intelligence war was about to begin, and Sarah would be at the center of the battle to protect NATO installations across the region from sophisticated surveillance and potential attack. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a secure briefing room at NATO headquarters in Brussels, addressing an assembly of senior military commanders and intelligence officials from across Europe. The young analyst who had been mocked at a remote airbase was now briefing some of the most powerful military leaders in the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "Operation Silent Shield has successfully identified and neutralized surveillance networks at 47 NATO installations across Eastern Europe. The transformation had been remarkable. Using the detection methods Sarah had developed, Joint Task Forces had uncovered an extensive intelligence-gathering operation that spanned multiple countries and threatened dozens of military facilities. The enemy surveillance network was far more extensive than we initially realized," Sarah continued, displaying a map showing the scope of the compromised installations. They had been systematically gathering intelligence across the entire theater of operations for over 2 years. General Morrison, who had become one of Sarah's strongest supporters, nodded approvingly. "The techniques developed by analyst Martinez have revolutionized our counterintelligence capabilities, but Sarah's success had come at a personal cost. The past 6 months had been a relentless cycle of deployments to threatened installations, analyzing enemy capabilities and developing countermeasures. She had saved countless lives and protected critical military assets, but she had also become a primary target for enemy operatives. The threat level against analyst Martinez remains elevated," reported Colonel Stevens, the task force security officer. "Intelligence suggests that enemy services have placed a high priority on neutralizing her capabilities." Sarah had grown accustomed to the constant security presence, the careful movement between installations, and the knowledge that professional killers were actively hunting her. It was a far cry from the academic environment where she had begun her career. "What's our assessment of current threat levels?" asked Admiral Foster, NATO's intelligence coordinator. Sarah pulled up detailed threat analysis charts. "Enemy surveillance operations have adapted significantly to our detection methods. They're using new technologies and different operational patterns, but we're staying ahead of their adaptations." The intelligence war had indeed become a technological arms race. As Sarah's team developed new detection capabilities, enemy operatives developed new methods to avoid detection. Each side constantly evolved their techniques in response to the other's innovations. "The most significant development," Sarah continued, "is that our success has forced enemy intelligence services to abandon passive surveillance in favor of more aggressive operations. This was both good news and bad news for NATO forces. The elimination of long-term surveillance networks had protected military secrets and operational plans. But the enemy's shift to more aggressive tactics had increased the immediate danger to NATO, personnel and facilities. We've documented 17 attempted infiltrations and 6 direct attacks against installations where we've neutralized surveillance networks, Sarah reported. The enemy is becoming more desperate and more dangerous. But there was also encouraging news. The detection methods Sarah had developed were being implemented across NATO's global network of installations. Other analysts were being trained in her techniques, creating a new generation of counterintelligence specialists. Training programs based on Martinez's methods are now operational at 15 NATO training centers, reported Major Williams, who had been promoted to oversee the expanded counterintelligence program. We're developing a comprehensive capability to detect and counter advanced surveillance operations. Sarah felt pride in knowing that her work was having such a broad impact, but she also felt the weight of responsibility. Every successful detection prevented potential attacks and saved lives, but every failure could result in catastrophic security breaches. "What's next for the program?" asked General Morrison. Sarah had been thinking about this question for weeks. "We need to transition from reactive detection to proactive prevention. Instead of waiting to find surveillance operations, we should develop capabilities to prevent them from being established in the first place." This represented the next evolution in the intelligence war, moving beyond detecting enemy operations to actually preventing them from succeeding. It would require new technologies, new analytical methods, and new operational approaches. "The enemy has shown remarkable adaptability," Sarah continued. "Our long-term success depends on staying ahead of their innovations, rather than just responding to their current capabilities." As the briefing concluded, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. From being mocked at a remote airbase to briefing NATO's senior leadership, her path had been unlike anything she could have imagined. But more importantly, the experience had taught her valuable lessons about perseverance, expertise, and the importance of standing up for professional analysis even when facing skepticism and ridicule. After the briefing, General Morrison approached her privately. "Sarah, I want you to know that your work has literally changed how NATO approaches counterintelligence. You've saved countless lives and protected critical operations across the alliance. Thank you, sir. But I also know that this is just the beginning. The enemy won't stop adapting, which means we can't stop innovating." Morrison smiled. "That's exactly the attitude that makes you so valuable to this organization. You're not just solving today's problems. You're anticipating tomorrow's challenges." As Sarah prepared for her next assignment, she thought about the personnel at her original base who had initially dismissed her capabilities. Many of them had since reached out to apologize and express their respect for her work. The mockery had been replaced by recognition and gratitude, but the most satisfying aspect of her success wasn't the recognition or the prestigious assignments. It was knowing that her work was making a real difference in protecting the people who serve their countries in dangerous and challenging environments. Staff Sergeant Miller, who had been among her harshest critics, had even requested assignment to one of her task force teams. When asked why, he had said simply, "Because I want to learn from the best." The transformation was complete, but Sarah knew that her real work was just beginning. The intelligence war would continue to evolve, new threats would emerge, and new challenges would test her capabilities. But she also knew that she had proven something important, that expertise and careful analysis could triumph over skepticism and prejudice. Her discovery of the surveillance network had been just the beginning of a career that would help shape the future of military, intelligence, and counterintelligence operations. As she boarded the aircraft that would take her to her next assignment, Sarah smiled slightly. Remembering the mockery she had endured just 6 months earlier, the laughter had indeed stopped when the sirens began to wail. But more importantly, it had been replaced by respect, recognition, and the knowledge that her work was protecting lives and preserving security. Across the alliance, the young analyst, who had been dismissed as inexperienced and naive, had become one of NATO's most valuable intelligence assets. And this was only the beginning of what would become a legendary career in military counterintelligence. The enemy networks she hunted continued to adapt and evolve, but so did Sarah and her team. The intelligence war would continue, But NATO now had capabilities and expertise that hadn't existed before her arrival at that remote airbase where everything began. The mockery had stopped. The real work had just begun.